What if the voice we trusted most in Hollywood had known all along? What if the man whose narration shaped generations of films, whose gravitas brought truth to fiction, had once stood just a few feet from a chilling secret and said nothing? And what if the silence wasn't cowardice, but fear? These aren't just questions. They're whispers, now growing louder, more urgent, and more uncomfortable than ever before. Because after a sudden, devastating tragedy shattered the Reiner family, one of Hollywood's most beloved dynasties, people began looking backward. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Not for blame, but for clues, for signals, for the warning signs we all missed, or worse, ignored. And among those names, Morgan Freeman. Yes, that Morgan Freeman, the Academy Award winner, the icon, the man everyone in the industry calls the voice of God. At 88, he's seen it all, worked with everyone, survived everything. So when rumors surfaced that Freeman had allegedly made comments years ago, subtle but pointed, about Nick Reiner, Rob's son and now the accused at the center of this tragedy, people listened. And then, just as swiftly, they questioned. If Morgan Freeman saw something, why didn't he say anything sooner? Why now? Why break silence at 88? Is it legacy, guilt, fear, or something even darker? This story is not about casting judgment. It's about the unbearable weight of hindsight, the cruelty of if only, and the terrifying notion that sometimes, even the wisest among us, icons like Freeman, carry truths they dare not speak until it's far, far too late. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's rewind. Let's go back, not just to what happened, but why this matters now. Because the Reiners were no ordinary family. They were, for decades, a pillar of Hollywood itself. Rob Reiner, actor, director, activist. The man behind When Harry Met Sally, A Few Good Men, A Princess Bride. And Michelle Reiner, his partner, both in life and behind the scenes. A photographer, producer, and fierce intellect in her own right. Together, they built not just a film empire, but a reputation, passionate, political, principled. A couple adored by audiences and insiders alike. When they walked into a room, at a gala, a premiere, a protest, people noticed. So when the news broke that both Rob and Michelle had been found dead in their Brentwood home, the silence that followed wasn't just grief, it was disbelief, shock, then confusion, then chaos, and then the unimaginable. Nick Reiner, their son, arrested, charged with first-degree murder. No forced entry, no intruder, just a family torn apart from the inside. And that's when the whispers started, because as news outlets scrambled for details, insiders turned inward. They remembered, they reflected, and they asked the question that no family, no friend, no co-star ever wants to ask. Did anyone see this coming? And that's when one name surfaced again and again in backroom conversations. Morgan Freeman. Why him? Why now? Because he'd worked with Rob. He'd dined with the family. He'd allegedly made a comment, years ago, about Nick's temperament. An offhand remark at a party. A quiet word to another actor. A sentence that, at the time, seemed meaningless. Until it wasn't. Until it became a puzzle piece in a horrifying mosaic no one wanted to see. Now, let's be clear from the start. Nothing in this video is confirmed fact unless sourced directly. These are claims, rumors, patterns, desperate attempts to make sense of a senseless act. But they matter, because they reflect a much larger issue. Hollywood's addiction to image. Its culture of silence. Its pattern of ignoring warning signs in the name of loyalty, reputation, and legacy. Rob Reiner wasn't just a public figure. He was a father. And that's what makes this story even more heart-wrenching. Because behind the camera, away from red carpets and awards, was a family trying to navigate something difficult, something fragile, something, perhaps, unspoken even between them. And that brings us back to Freeman. According to multiple unnamed sources, Freeman and Reiner had a relationship built on respect, but not without tension. Freeman admired Reiner's activism, but had allegedly expressed concern about his family dynamics in the past. Again, nothing proven, just fragments. Fragments that mean nothing, until they mean everything. And now, at 88, as headlines resurface and eyes turn toward anyone who might have known more, Freeman is said to have broken his silence. Not with a press conference, Not with a memoir chapter, but with a comment, a phrase, an acknowledgement. Private? Perhaps. Public? Maybe not yet. But it was enough to reignite the fire. Because when Morgan Freeman speaks, people don't just hear him, they believe him. And now, people are asking, what did he really know? Was his silence a kindness or complicity? And if the rumors are true, what exactly did he say? This story isn't about finger-pointing. It's about the weight of knowing, the quiet agony of, I should have said something, and the haunting possibility that even our heroes, our icons, sometimes choose silence over confrontation. We'll explore it all. The rise of the Reiner family, the troubled history of Nick, the nature of Hollywood legacies, the culture that breeds silence, the whispers around Freeman, the implications of what he might have known, and why he didn't speak until now. We'll piece together interviews, reactions, timelines, and testimonies. Because somewhere in this tangled mess lies a truth. And someone, maybe Morgan Freeman, is finally ready to speak it. But first, we need to go back to where it all began. Before the crime, before the suspicion, before the silence. Back to the carefully curated image of a Hollywood family. Because once you see what was really happening behind the smiles and the scripts, you may never look at them the same way again. And as we peel back the layers, remember this. Not all horror stories take place in the dark. Some unfold under the blinding lights of fame, where everyone's watching, but no one sees. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What does perfection look like from the outside? Red carpets, golden trophies, smiling family portraits under soft studio lighting, the illusion of harmony, framed in mahogany and propped on the walls of Bel Air mansions. But what if the image is the disguise? What if every perfect Hollywood family has a secret, locked behind a closed door, smiling tightly for the cameras, while something quietly, dangerously simmers behind the scenes? Because that's where this story begins, with a facade. A beautiful one, a carefully crafted one, but a facade nonetheless. For decades, Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle were the image of a power couple, A-list royalty. He, the director of some of America's most iconic films. She, a behind-the-scenes creative force and activist with elegance, grace, and fire. They didn't just appear to be in sync, they built an entire world together. Studios, campaigns, political fundraisers, philanthropy. Their names were whispered in Hollywood with respect, not scandal. Admiration, not whispers. To most people, the Reiners weren't just Hollywood's good guys. They were untouchable. But behind the brilliance, beneath the legacy, there was a different story. One that very few dared to even mention, and even fewer truly understood. It began, as many tragedies do, with the desperate need to protect an image. Because in Hollywood, image is currency, and the Reiners were rich. But no image, no matter how polished, can cover up the sound of a house creaking under the pressure of silence. Especially when it involved their son, Nick Reiner. From an early age, there were rumors. Quiet ones. Whispers passed through assistants, managers, and agents. He's going through a phase. He's just struggling to find himself. He's under pressure from his father's legacy. But beneath the carefully chosen language was an uneasy truth. Nick Reiner didn't fit the mold. And in Hollywood, when something doesn't fit, you don't fix it, you hide it. They say Rob was a father who loved deeply but demanded silently. That he had a habit of not saying certain things out loud. Not because he was heartless, but because he believed in privacy, dignity, protecting his family from the carnivorous press. But protection, when weaponized, can become denial. And denial? That's where the danger grows. Let's talk about Nick. Publicly, he was introduced to the world as a writer, a creative. He even co-wrote Being Charlie, a semi-autobiographical film about addiction, co-directed by none other than his father, Rob. It was supposed to be a triumphant moment, a family healing through art, a comeback story, a victory, and maybe, for a while it was. But behind closed doors, things weren't so simple. The industry knew it. Some friends allegedly saw the signs. That tightness in Rob's smile when Nick's name came up, the long pauses in interviews, the cautious optimism that never quite rang true. Because here's the truth no one wants to say out loud. In Hollywood, image is oxygen, and no one survives long if they admit the air is running out. That's why people look the other way. It's why no one questioned the Reiner's public narrative. After all, What would be the point? They were a success story. But ask yourself this. How many success stories end in headlines like these? Beloved Hollywood director found dead at 78. Son charged with first-degree murder. Family legacy ends in tragedy. It wasn't just a fall from grace. It was a plunge into something darker, deeper than anyone could have imagined. And yet, even now, people struggle to reconcile the facts with the faces. Rob and Michelle gone. Nick accused. Morgan Freeman silent until recently. But back then, no one saw it coming. Or at least, they didn't admit it. Because the Reiners had mastered the art of looking composed, of saying just enough, of presenting a united front. Let's go back to one of their last major public appearances, an industry gala in Los Angeles, just a few months before everything changed. Rob stood at the podium, delivering a speech about the importance of creative freedom. Michelle sat at a table nearby, smiling with polite warmth. Nick wasn't there. He hadn't been seen publicly in months. And yet, no one asked why. Because that's the rule in Hollywood. You don't ask uncomfortable questions at glamorous events. You toast. You smile. You talk about scripts, not skeletons. But according to one source close to the family, who requested anonymity, Michelle had grown increasingly withdrawn in the final year. Not publicly, not dramatically, just quieter. Fewer appearances, fewer statements, less of the fire she was known for. Was she tired? Burned out? Or was something happening at home no one wanted to confront? That's the part no one can answer, not with certainty. But in retrospect, it paints a disturbing picture. A family, proud and private, tiptoeing around something they couldn't control. A son, possibly unraveling. And two parents who, for all their power and prestige, were powerless in the one place that mattered most, their own home. Now, let's be clear, none of this is about shaming a family in pain. It's about understanding how Hollywood allows this pain to fester. Because when everything depends on looking perfect, there's no room for honesty, no space to fall apart. And sometimes, that silence becomes deadly. Let's also not forget the pressure Nick must have felt. Growing up as the son of Rob Reiner isn't just a shadow, it's a mountain. The expectations, the comparisons, the inevitable question. Are you going to follow in your father's footsteps? And when you can't live up to the legacy, where do you go? For some, it's therapy. For others, rebellion. But for a few, it's something far worse. The industry is filled with second-generation cautionary tales. But most of them don't end in blood. So what happened here? Was it slow and inevitable? Or sudden and unthinkable? One former colleague of Rob's, who spoke off the record, said this. He never wanted to talk about Nick. You could feel it. He'd smile, nod, say he's doing great, but his eyes would shift. There was weight behind it. Another friend recalled a dinner party where Nick allegedly stormed out after an argument no one wanted to talk about. Rob tried to laugh it off. Michelle just looked embarrassed. No one asked questions. We just moved on. Moved on. That phrase keeps showing up in these stories. Because that's what people in Hollywood do. They move on. From discomfort. From warning signs. From anything that threatens the image. But images are fragile. And sometimes, the cracks are too deep to hide forever. Because even the most polished family portrait can't hide the truth when the frame finally breaks. And that's exactly what happened in that Brentwood home. The frame shattered. And what was left behind? Shock. Blood. Questions. Silence. And the haunting realization that maybe, just maybe, someone had seen it coming all along. Because the perfect Hollywood family doesn't exist. And sometimes, the closer you look at the image, the more you start to see the darkness hiding underneath. But what if someone had tried to say something? What if the silence wasn't universal? What if, long before the tragedy, someone in the inner circle tried to raise the alarm? And what if that someone was Morgan Freeman? Because in the next chapter, we dive into the person everyone is suddenly revisiting, not just for what he said, but for what he didn't say. What happens when a name makes a room go quiet? Not awkward quiet, not polite quiet, the kind of quiet that lands like a dropped glass. Sharp, sudden, unmistakable. That was the effect Nick's name reportedly had in certain circles. You could feel it, people say. The shift. The way conversation would pivot just a few degrees off course. As if the air itself had decided, collectively, to look away. No accusations. No raised voices. Just a subtle agreement that some subjects were better left untouched. Why? Because in Hollywood, silence is often the loudest admission of all. Nick Reiner wasn't a mystery to the industry. Not exactly. People knew who he was. They knew where he came from. They knew the doors that opened automatically because of his last name, and the expectations that followed him through every single one of them. What they didn't know, or didn't want to know, was what happened when the doors closed. When the cameras shut off. When the dinners ended. When the smiles dropped. And that's where the discomfort began. From the outside, Nick's story was framed as a familiar Hollywood arc. A legacy kid navigating the pressures of fame. A creative finding his voice. A son collaborating with his father on a deeply personal project. That film, often described as raw and confessional, was praised for its honesty. But honesty on screen doesn't always translate to honesty in life. Behind that narrative, according to people who claimed proximity to the family, there were concerns. Not the kind that made headlines. The kind that never do. Mood swings. Isolation. Friction that didn't resolve itself neatly after a heartfelt conversation or a rehab stint or a promising new project. And here's the contradiction that haunted the family for years. Publicly, Nick was described as doing better. Privately, those close to the situation say the phrase was doing a lot of heavy lifting. Better compared to what? Better than last year? Better than the worst moments? Or just better at hiding it? Ask yourself this. How many times have you heard someone say, "He's doing better," without ever asking what better actually means? That's how this story lived for so long. In vague reassurances. In half-truths. In careful phrasing that avoided specifics. Because specifics invite scrutiny. And scrutiny is dangerous when your entire life has been built on a narrative of control. Nick's relationship with his father was, by most accounts, complicated. Loving, yes. Proud, certainly. But also heavy. Weighted with expectation and disappointment in equal measure. Rob Reiner was a titan. A man whose work shaped cultural conversations. A director whose voice mattered. A figure who didn't just make movies, he made statements. Being his son meant living in a permanent comparison you never asked for. Every success felt borrowed. Every failure felt magnified. And people around Nick noticed the strain. The way he bristled at being introduced as Rob Reiner's son. The way he reportedly oscillated between wanting independence and needing approval. The way anger, when it surfaced, didn't always come with warning. Was it unusual? Maybe not. Was it concerning? Some thought so. But concern is easy to rationalize away when wrapped in privilege. He's just intense. He's passionate. He's misunderstood. Those are the words people use when they don't want to say the harder ones. And Michelle, by all accounts, played the role of mediator. The bridge. The one who smoothed edges and calmed tempers. Friends say she was deeply protective of Nick, perhaps more so than Rob, who struggled between being a father and being a public figure. But protection can become pressure. And pressure, when it builds, doesn't just disappear. It explodes. What makes this chapter of the story so uncomfortable is not what's known, but what isn't. The gaps. The missing pieces. The moments people now replay in their minds, asking themselves if they should have paid closer attention. There was the dinner Nick didn't attend. The call that went unanswered. The argument that ended abruptly when someone walked out of the room. None of it seemed significant at the time. Until it did. And this is where the silence becomes deafening. Because even now, with investigations ongoing and narratives still forming, there is a collective hesitation to speak plainly about Nick. To describe him without qualifiers. To acknowledge that something may have been seriously wrong. Why? Because acknowledging that opens a door no one wants to walk through. It forces people to confront a brutal truth. That sometimes, love isn't enough to fix what's broken. That sometimes, legacy can't shield you. That sometimes, warning signs are obvious only after the damage is done. And in Hollywood, where reputation is everything, that truth is almost unbearable. It's easier to talk around the subject, to soften the edges, to lean on ambiguity. But ambiguity is exactly what allowed this story to unfold unchecked. Consider this. Multiple people, independently, have described Nick as someone who kept to himself in the years leading up to the tragedy. Not antisocial, not withdrawn in a clinical sense, just distant. Distance can be healthy, but it can also be a warning, especially when paired with volatility. One former acquaintance described a version of Nick that alternated between charm and intensity. He could be incredibly warm, they said. And then suddenly, something would flip. You never knew which version you were going to get. Again, not proof of anything. But patterns matter. And patterns are what people are desperately trying to piece together now. What makes it harder is the fact that Rob and Michelle never publicly addressed these issues. Not directly, not honestly. They spoke in generalities. About love, about family, about creativity as healing. And maybe they believed it. Maybe they truly thought things were improving. Parents often do. But belief doesn't change reality. And reality has a way of forcing itself into the light, whether you're ready or not. The industry, for its part, followed the family's lead. No probing questions. No uncomfortable interviews. No investigative pieces. Why would they? Rob Reiner wasn't just respected. He was protected. So the silence expanded. And the distance grew. And the tension thickened. Until one day, there was no image left to protect. What's most haunting about this chapter isn't the idea that Nick was the problem. That framing is too simple, too lazy, too cruel. What's haunting is the realization that he may have been struggling in ways no one knew how, or was willing to confront. And that brings us back to the question that refuses to go away. If people around the family sensed something was wrong, why didn't anyone speak up? Were they afraid of being wrong? Of being intrusive? Of damaging a legacy? Or were they afraid of something else entirely? Because there's a difference between avoiding a topic out of politeness and avoiding it out of fear. And according to some, fear may have played a bigger role than anyone wants to admit, which raises a chilling possibility. What if Nick wasn't just the topic people avoided? What if he was the presence people quietly worried about? And if that's true, if the discomfort went deeper than awkwardness, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Who noticed first? Who sensed that the silence wasn't just emotional, but dangerous? And why does one name keep surfacing whenever that question is asked? Because in the next chapter, we turn to the alleged warnings. The comments that were brushed off. The moments that didn't seem important, until everything fell apart. And if those warnings were real, then someone heard them. What came next didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It arrived quietly, casually, almost jokingly. And that's what makes it so terrifying. What does a warning look like when no one wants to hear it? Is it loud and urgent? Or is it subtle, buried in a half-joke, disguised as concern, quickly brushed aside with a chuckle? Because when it came to Nick Reiner, the warnings, if they existed, weren't alarms. They were whispers. Quiet, fleeting, unconfirmed. And that's exactly why they were so easy to ignore. In Hollywood, power has a way of making people listen, but it also has a way of making them forget. When someone is respected, as beloved, as Rob Reiner has a family issue, people don't push. They smile. They nod. They respect boundaries. But sometimes, behind closed doors, people speak a little more freely. And that's where this chapter begins, with the whispers, the offhand remarks, the sidelong glances, the moments that, in hindsight, feel like red flags fluttering right under everyone's nose. Let's talk about the first alleged warning. It wasn't shouted from a rooftop. It wasn't posted online. It was, according to one industry source, muttered in a dressing room after a table read. The story goes like this. Rob and Nick had just finished collaborating on Being Charlie. Spirits were high. The project had potential. A film about addiction, co-written by a father and son, exploring pain through art. It had all the makings of a redemption arc. But one crew member, present during several early script discussions, reportedly said, there was tension in the room. You could feel it. Rob was patient. Nick was unpredictable. It wasn't creative friction. It was something else. The same source claimed that after one particularly tense exchange, a veteran actor, who had known the Reiner family for years, pulled someone aside and said, half seriously, half concerned, I don't know what's going on there, but if something snaps, it won't be in front of a camera. Let that sink in. If something snaps, it won't be in front of a camera. A chilling phrase, one that seemed meaningless at the time. But now, it feels like a shadow cast backwards from the future. And that wasn't the only moment. Over the next few years, other reports, quiet ones, from assistants, interns, secondhand conversations, painted a picture of instability that no one wanted to fully acknowledge. Because acknowledging it meant confronting a deeper fear. That something wasn't just off. It was dangerous. One source described a heated private encounter at a Malibu fundraiser. Nick, who was not publicly listed as attending, allegedly showed up unexpectedly, tense, agitated. He was seen speaking to Rob in a corner of the tent, hands moving, voices raised. Most people chalked it up to family drama, a disagreement, nothing more. But a staff member working security that night remembered Rob's face as Nick walked away. He looked shaken, not angry, not frustrated, just rattled. Like someone who just realized they couldn't fix something. Again, nothing criminal. Nothing that would trigger police reports or restraining orders. Just discomfort, just unease. But what do we do with that unease? What do we do when people say they saw something, but didn't know what they were looking at? Here's the thing. In the moment, warnings rarely feel like warnings. They feel like anecdotes, gossip, personality quirks, until the day they become evidence. There's also the alleged party comment, the one tied to Morgan Freeman. Multiple reports claim that Freeman, during a private gathering years ago, made a cryptic remark about Nick. The context was a conversation about young Hollywood talent, addiction, and second chances. Freeman, known for his calm tone and slow delivery, reportedly leaned in and said, "Sometimes the darkness doesn't leave, even when the lights come on." When asked what he meant, he allegedly followed up with, "Rob's boy. That one worries me." Now, let's be crystal clear. These are unconfirmed reports. Freeman himself has not gone on record about this. No transcript, no video, no audio, but the story exists. It has floated through back channels, passed from one assistant to another, from one screenwriter to another producer, quietly, consistently. And in the world of Hollywood, consistency means something. Because for every outright lie, there are 10 half-truths that contain a sliver of reality. Did Morgan Freeman really say it? Maybe, maybe not. But even the existence of that rumor adds another layer of weight to this story. Because if someone like Morgan Freeman saw the storm brewing and still kept quiet, what hope did anyone else have? One former co-star of Rob's put it this way: Rob was a fortress, kind, generous, but private, especially about Nick. If you brought him up, Rob's whole energy changed. Like a wall went up. You just learned not to go there. Another director who worked with Reiner in the early 2010s recalled a moment on set when Rob's phone kept buzzing. He stepped away, took the call, returned with a visible shift in demeanor. Someone joked, "Everything okay?" Reiner's reply, "It's always okay, until it's not." At the time, it sounded like a joke. Now, it echoes like a prophecy. And that's the tragedy of these alleged warnings. They weren't dismissed because people didn't care. They were dismissed because people didn't want to believe something darker was possible. Not in that family. Not with those people. It's easier to joke. Easier to downplay. Easier to say, he's just dealing with some stuff. But what if some stuff is the beginning of something irreversible? What if we've trained ourselves so thoroughly to avoid confrontation, we've forgotten how to recognize crisis? Because in this story, there wasn't one big, flashing, neon sign that said danger. There were dozens of little ones. Dim, flickering, easy to overlook. And that's what makes them so terrifying in retrospect. Because for every moment that felt a little off, for every interaction that felt strained, there was an opportunity to ask harder questions, to listen more closely, to stop dismissing discomfort as inconvenience. But no one did. And now, 2 people are dead, and their son is in custody. And a Hollywood legend, Morgan Freeman, is being quietly scrutinized for what he may or may not have known. And the world is asking, how did this happen? The answer? It didn't happen all at once. It happened in pieces, in warning signs, in quiet conversations, in the soft, slippery slope of collective denial. And somewhere, amid all those moments, someone, maybe Morgan Freeman, may have seen just enough to feel afraid, but didn't say enough to change the outcome. And that brings us to the next chapter. Not the warnings, but the man at the center of those warnings. Because it's time to turn the spotlight on the voice we've trusted for decades. The voice that has guided us through documentaries, dramas, and defining moments in film. The voice that may now carry the heaviest truth of all. In the next chapter, we dive into Morgan Freeman's role in this unraveling tale. Not as a narrator, not as a bystander, but as someone who might have seen the storm gathering and stayed quiet anyway. What does it mean when the voice of truth goes silent? What happens when the man whose words have given life to justice, redemption, and wisdom says nothing at all? Morgan Freeman is not just an actor. He is the voice, the narrator of truth in countless documentaries, the sage figure who arrives in films to deliver clarity in chaos, the man whose presence in a movie instantly signals gravity, honesty, and moral balance. So when whispers began circulating that Morgan Freeman had once made unsettling comments about Nick Reiner, years before the tragedy, people didn't just listen. They reeled. Because if Morgan Freeman saw something, why didn't he say more? Or worse, why did he say something privately and then vanish from the conversation? This chapter is not about casting blame. It's about confronting the heavy, uncomfortable truth behind an action. The truth that even icons, legends, are human. And humans are scared of making enemies in Hollywood. Let's start with what we do know. Morgan Freeman and Rob Reiner had a professional relationship spanning decades. Freeman appeared in films distributed or produced by studios affiliated with Reiner's network. They shared charity events, sat on similar panels, and were often aligned on political issues, particularly around social justice and civil liberties. They weren't best friends, but they were respected peers. Two titans. Two men whose reputations carried weight both on and off the screen. So when rumors began to swirl that Freeman had once expressed concern about Nick Reiner, people paid attention. Let's rewind to the early 2010s. According to an unnamed source close to a now-defunct production company, Morgan Freeman allegedly made a cryptic remark during a private conversation in Santa Barbara, following a celebrity fundraising event. They were talking about young people in Hollywood, addiction, anger, the pressure of legacy, and Freeman, sipping whiskey, allegedly leaned back and said, "Some fires don't go out, even when the rain comes. Some just hide until the wind hits them again." It sounded poetic, classic Freeman, riddled with metaphor. But when asked later by a nearby producer if he was talking about someone specific, he reportedly nodded and said, "Rob's boy, there's pain there. And pain without peace. That's a dangerous thing." No follow-up, no elaboration. Just a slow sip of his drink and a change of subject. At the time, it didn't seem ominous. Morgan had always spoken in metaphor. He was the philosopher of the party circuit, the man whose words often floated above concrete meaning. But now, in hindsight, people are asking, was that a warning? Was that his way of sounding the alarm? And if so, why didn't he speak louder? The answer might lie in the delicate balance of Hollywood power. Morgan Freeman, despite his stature, is no stranger to controversy. In 2018, he faced allegations of inappropriate conduct, claims which he denied, and which were never criminally pursued. But the incident reminded everyone that no one is untouchable in this town. Even Freeman knows that alliances are everything. And Rob Reiner wasn't just powerful. He was respected, the kind of man you didn't cross unless you had no other choice. Speaking openly about someone's child, especially someone like Nick, would have been seen as betrayal, invasive, disrespectful. So maybe Freeman did what so many others in Hollywood do when they sense trouble. He stepped back. He made his cryptic comments. He let his concern live quietly in metaphor. And then he moved on. But the guilt, they say, never really does. Fast forward to 2025. The tragedy hits. Rob and Michelle are gone. Nick is in custody. And suddenly, all those whispers from years ago come roaring back to the surface. Old interviews are rewatched. Past conversations are reanalyzed. And Morgan Freeman, at 88, finds himself pulled into a storm he never wanted to revisit. And then, a moment. An off-the-record quote appears in a respected Hollywood insider blog. It reads, "I should have said more." But saying more back then wouldn't have changed a thing. No one wants to hear bad news about someone they love. The blog claimed the quote came from Freeman. His reps declined to comment. He didn't deny it. But he didn't confirm it either. Silence again. But this silence felt different. It felt heavy, reflective, almost remorseful. Because whether he said that line or not, the truth behind it lingers. Sometimes, people do see something, but they don't say it. Not because they don't care, but because they don't believe they'll be heard. And that's the brutal irony. Morgan Freeman, the man who made his career being heard, didn't speak up in a way that mattered. Or maybe he did. And people just weren't listening. And now? Now, he's left with that eternal question. What if I had been louder? What if I had pulled Rob aside? Pressed him? Challenged him? What if I'd broken the sacred rule of privacy and gone public? Would it have changed anything? Or would I have lost a friend and still watched this tragedy unfold from a distance? There's no easy answer, because Morgan Freeman's silence, like so many others, wasn't born of apathy. It was born of fear, of respect, of uncertainty, of the impossible position of speaking out without proof. And let's be honest, in Hollywood, where relationships are currency, accusing someone's child of being unstable without hard evidence is social and professional suicide. So most people stay quiet, even the legends, even the narrators, even Morgan Freeman. But here's the thing about silence. It doesn't absolve you. It just delays the weight of truth. And now, at 88, Morgan Freeman may be carrying that weight heavier than ever. Whether he speaks again or not, the damage is done. The story is no longer just about what happened. It's about what didn't happen, the words unsaid, the warnings unspoken, the chances unclaimed. And as Freeman retreats once more into silence, the rest of us are left with a haunting thought. Sometimes the people who could say the most say the least. Not because they don't know better, but because they know exactly what speaking up might cost. But what did Rob Reiner know? Because while Morgan Freeman may have suspected, there are now whispers that Rob himself was afraid. Afraid of what was coming. Afraid of what was already inside his home. And if that's true, it changes everything. What does fear look like when it wears the face of your child? It doesn't scream. It doesn't slam doors. It doesn't threaten to run away in the middle of the night. No, this kind of fear is quiet. It hides behind long silences at the dinner table, behind glances that linger too long, behind doors that stay locked, not for safety, but for survival. And according to those who were closest to him, Rob Reiner may have lived with that kind of fear, not in the dramatic Hollywood thriller sense, not in the I'm in danger way you see on screen, but in a much more subtle, much more devastating form. Emotional dread. That slow-building awareness that something is not okay, that someone you love deeply might be unraveling right before your eyes. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. So you pretend, you perform, you hope. Because what's the alternative? To admit you're afraid of your own son? That was never the Reiner way. At least, not publicly. But behind the walls of that Brentwood home, something may have been deeply, desperately wrong. Let's start with a strange pattern. Over the past 5 years, Rob Reiner, normally outspoken, fiery, almost combative on political issues, began to retreat ever so slightly from the public eye. His social media posts thinned out. His public appearances became more curated. He declined interviews where once he would have eagerly offered commentary. At the time, most chalked it up to age, burnout, fatigue, but insiders suggest there was more to it. One producer who worked closely with Rob on a documentary project in 2022 described a distinct change in mood. He was distracted, always checking his phone, always anxious. He'd step out of meetings, and when he came back, he was a little more tight, wound up. That wasn't like him. Another friend claimed that Rob had quietly started seeing a therapist, not for himself, but to understand someone close to him. When pressed, the friend declined to name who. But everyone suspected. Nick. Because Nick had become unpredictable. Not dangerous, per se, but difficult, defensive, distant. He would vanish for weeks without contact, then show up at the house with stories that didn't quite add up. Mood swings, intensity, grand plans one moment, complete withdrawal the next. And Rob didn't talk about it. He never talked about it, not even to his closest friends. But the signs were there. Small, quiet indicators that the man who once commanded every room he walked into was retreating inside his own life. A neighbor recalled seeing Rob walking his dog late at night, alone, unshaven, distracted. Not the polished, composed man they were used to seeing. He looked like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders. One particularly haunting recollection came from a longtime family friend. At a private gathering, Michelle was talking about the stresses of aging parents. Careers, politics, the usual light chatter. Then someone jokingly said, "At least the kids are grown. You guys are in the clear now." Michelle smiled. But Rob? Rob looked down, said nothing, took a sip of his drink. When someone nudged him, "Hey Rob, what's on your mind?" He reportedly muttered, "Sometimes the hardest part starts when they're grown." It seemed like a joke, but now it sounds like a confession. Because by all accounts, Rob Reiner loved his son. There was no doubt about that. But love doesn't cancel out fear. And the more you love someone, the more terrifying it becomes to admit that they may be spiraling out of control. So Rob did what so many parents do. He hoped. He helped. He hung on. He produced a film with Nick. He gave him space. He paid for treatment, therapy, retreats. He did everything a father could do. But here's the thing about denial. It disguises itself as hope. It whispers, this time it'll be different. He's trying. He just needs one more chance. Until one day, that chance runs out. Until the hope curdles into fear. And that's when silence becomes a prison. According to another anonymous source, Rob confided once, only once, that he wasn't sure what else to do. He allegedly said it during a brief phone call with a former collaborator. The context? A missed deadline. A broken commitment. Nick had been involved. Something had gone sideways. Rob's voice, the source said, was heavy. Not angry. Not frustrated. Just tired. I've tried everything. And I don't want to lose him. But I'm afraid I already have. Was he talking about emotional distance? Or something darker? We may never know. Because Rob never spoke publicly about it. He protected Nick until the very end. Even as the strain deepened. Even as Michelle, according to some, began quietly distancing herself from public functions where Nick might be present. Even as close friends noted a quiet tension that always seemed to follow the family whenever they were all in the same room. Still, Rob said nothing. Because how do you go on CNN and speak about gun control and democracy when your own son is breaking apart? How do you preach justice on Twitter when your own household feels like it's held together with whispers and worry? You don't. You pretend. You persevere. You hold on tighter. But sometimes, even that's not enough. And that brings us to the week before the tragedy. Rob had reportedly canceled a long-standing engagement at a university lecture. No explanation given, just a quiet withdrawal. Michelle had pulled out of a panel event she was scheduled to moderate, something she never did. No public statement. No press coverage. Just a vanishing act. And then, silence. Until the headlines broke. And the world stopped. Because no one thought it would end like this. Not with them. Not in that house. But maybe, just maybe, they did. And that's the most chilling possibility of all. That Rob Reiner may have seen the storm coming. Felt it inching closer every day, and didn't know how to stop it. Not because he was weak, but because he was a father. And fathers hope, even when fear is screaming in the background. And now, that hope is gone. And the fear that was once locked behind closed doors has exploded into full view. And we're all left asking, did he know? Did he see it coming? And if he did, why didn't he act? But maybe the better question is this. What could he have done? Because sometimes, when love becomes fear, you lose the ability to tell the difference. And speaking of fear, there was more of it, outside the home, than anyone realized. Because while Rob may have been afraid within the walls of his house, Hollywood itself was practicing a different kind of fear. The fear of exposure. Of admitting what everyone knew, but no one would say out loud. And in the next chapter, we confront that fear head on. Because this wasn't just a family tragedy. It was an industry failure. One that's happened before. And one that, if the system stays the same, will happen again. What do you do when the system itself is complicit? When tragedy isn't just a result of one person's unraveling, but the slow, silent collapse of an entire culture? Hollywood sells stories. It thrives on conflict, triumph, and transformation. But when the story is real, raw, unfiltered, and painful, Hollywood turns away. Not because it can't handle the truth, but because it doesn't want to deal with the fallout. This chapter isn't about one man. Not Rob. Not Nick. Not even Morgan Freeman. It's about all of them, and everyone who helped create the illusion that everything was fine. Because in Hollywood, perception isn't just everything. It's survival. And when that survival depends on protecting names, reputations, dynasties, truth gets buried, concern gets minimized, and red flags get rebranded as eccentricity. Let's take a hard look at the system that allowed this tragedy to fester. The Reiner family had what many would call Hollywood immunity. Respect. Acclaim. Decades of goodwill banked across every corner of the industry. Who would want to question that? Who would dare? When you're Rob Reiner, people don't interrogate your choices. They admire them, even when those choices seem off. Even when whispers swirl. Because in this town, reputation is a currency more valuable than any contract. And that's why the industry, producers, agents, friends, stayed quiet. They saw the signs. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to raise eyebrows. Enough to feel the tension. Enough to know, deep down, that something wasn't right. But they didn't act. Why? Because to challenge a name like Reiner's is to risk your place in the room. It's to gamble your own standing on a fight that may never pay off. Hollywood doesn't reward whistleblowers. It isolates them. Ask anyone who's ever gone public about abuse, addiction, or dysfunction in this industry. The backlash is swift, subtle, but brutal. Suddenly, you're not collaborative. You're difficult, not concerned, but meddling. And once that label sticks, the phone stops ringing. So when people around the Reiner family noticed Nick's volatility, his mood swings, his erratic behavior, his uncomfortable presence, they didn't intervene. They adjusted. They invited him less. They kept conversations surface level. They learned how to smile, nod, and move on. Not because they were heartless, but because this is how Hollywood operates. Conflict is for the screen. Not for the green room. Not for the gala. Not for the family of one of Hollywood's greats. And when someone did try to speak up, they were often met with deflection. He's just going through something. It's not our place. They're handling it. And perhaps the most devastating one of all. It's not that bad. That phrase, "it's not that bad," is the anthem of Hollywood denial. It's the line that lets everyone off the hook. It's how tragedies keep breathing just beneath the surface, unseen and unspoken, until it's too late. Because the moment someone is brave enough to push harder, the walls go up. They're gossiping. They're jealous. They're overstepping. So what do people do? They stop pushing. They stop asking. They stop caring. And slowly, the system rots from the inside. Let's zoom out. This isn't the first time a high-profile family in Hollywood has suffered a devastating internal collapse. The warnings were there for Judy Garland, exploited until she was addicted to pills just to get through the day. The red flags were flashing around Britney Spears for years before #FreeBritney ever trended. Even someone like River Phoenix, whose overdose shocked the world, had people saying afterward, "We should have known." And yet, time after time, Hollywood repeats the cycle. Whispers, denial, tragedy, shock, and then silence, until the next one. Because in an industry that prioritizes box office over boundaries, talent over truth, fame over family, there's no room for uncomfortable conversations, especially when those conversations involve powerful people. So let's bring it back to the Reiners. Rob was one of the untouchables, not because he demanded it, but because the industry granted it. He earned his place. And once you're in, no one wants to be the one who drags your name through the dirt, even if dragging it through the truth might save a life. So the whispers continued. The stories about Nick, the discomfort, the tension, but no one made a move. Because it's easier to lose sleep at night than risk a career during the day. And that's the brutal hypocrisy of Hollywood. A place that preaches empathy on screen, but practices silence off screen. A town full of therapists, coaches, support groups, but still incapable of confronting its own addictions. To image, to legacy, to silence. And what happens when silence becomes policy? People die, not always physically, sometimes emotionally, spiritually, creatively. But in the Reiners case, literally, 2 people dead. Because no one wanted to ask the hard questions. Because no one wanted to be the villain in someone else's story. Because no one wanted to risk being right about something they prayed was wrong. And now, it's too late. The family is shattered. The legacy is stained. And the industry is pretending to be shocked. But deep down, it's not shocked. It's guilty. Guilty of looking away. Guilty of making silence fashionable. Guilty of letting the image matter more than the people behind it. And this isn't just about Hollywood's elite. It trickles down to crew members afraid to speak up, to interns who see things but don't know who to tell, to assistants who clean up the messes and carry the secrets home. Everyone plays a part, some louder, some quieter, but all complicit, because silence is contagious. And in this town, it's lethal. So where do we go from here? That's the question no one wants to answer. Because to change the culture is to confront it, to admit that we've built an empire on pretending. And sometimes pretending kills. But there was one night when the pretending almost cracked. One night when the illusion nearly slipped, when something happened in that house that, according to multiple unverified sources, changed everything. And in the next chapter, we go there, To the night the Reiners stopped hiding. To the night where fear became reality. To the night that would haunt everyone who knew them. Because it wasn't an explosion. It was a slow ignition. And the match had already been struck. It didn't begin with a scream. There was no shattering glass. No doors kicked in. No alarms blaring through the Los Angeles night. Just a quiet, ordinary Sunday in a not-so-ordinary home. And by the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was already too late. Because sometimes, the most devastating events don't happen all at once. They build slowly, quietly, whispering chaos into the corners of a house long before the world outside hears a thing. And according to several close sources, this was that night. The night the perfect image shattered. The night love turned to silence. The night the truth could no longer be ignored. Let's rewind. Brentwood. A calm, upscale neighborhood tucked into West Los Angeles. Known for its affluence, its manicured lawns, its tight-lipped discretion. The kind of place where celebrities go to disappear. To blend in. To pretend normal still exists. The Reiner estate was one of many in the area. Big, but not showy. Elegant, but not excessive. A home that, from the outside, gave off the appearance of peace. But inside, something was brewing. According to multiple sources familiar with the Reiner family's inner circle, the week leading up to that Sunday had been tense. Not unusual, but charged. Michelle was said to be frustrated. Rob was distracted. And Nick was back. Not just physically, but emotionally, present in a way that made people uneasy. He'd been absent for a while. Off the radar, as one family friend described it. Then suddenly, there he was, showing up unannounced. Staying longer than expected. Hovering, pacing, inserting himself into conversations with a kind of jittery energy that made everyone else tighten their smiles. He was trying to be normal, said one insider. But you could tell something was off. It felt like he was walking through someone else's life, like he didn't belong, and he knew it. That Sunday started like many others. Late breakfast, newspapers, a quiet morning. No house staff reported anything strange. No deliveries. No arguments heard from outside. No signs that the Reiner family, Hollywood royalty, was about to face its darkest hour. But here's what is known, or rather, what's been pieced together since. Sometime between 1 o'clock and 2 p.m., security cameras in the neighborhood captured movement near the Reiner home. Nothing alarming. Just Nick, reportedly walking the perimeter. Hands in pockets. Head down. An hour later, the house went silent. No movement. No activity. No one entering or leaving. Then, radio silence. No calls. No messages. No updates. For a family that was usually so connected, so in sync, even in their private way, that silence was unusual. It wasn't until later that evening, around 5:30 p.m., that the first real alarm was raised. A family friend had been trying to reach Michelle about an upcoming charity event. No answer. 2 texts. A call. Voicemail. Still, not totally out of the ordinary. But something didn't sit right. This friend had a gut feeling. So they tried Rob. Nothing. Tried the house line. Straight to voicemail. Still, no panic. Not yet. Just a low hum of discomfort. But when Rob and Michelle failed to show up to a dinner they'd confirmed earlier in the week, that's when the real worry began. A call was placed to their daughter. Then to a private security contact. Then, finally, to the LAPD. What officers found when they arrived at the scene was described as calm, still, and horrifying. Rob and Michelle Reiner, found lifeless. No signs of forced entry. No clear indication of struggle. The details have not been released to the public, and for good reason. But what leaked in the days following were fragments. Glimpses of a scene that told a silent story. A knife, 2 bodies, and Nick Reiner, missing. He was located hours later in a park near downtown Los Angeles. Sitting alone, calm, silent. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He just waited. What happened inside that house between 2 o'clock and 5 p.m., no one knows for sure. Investigators are piecing it together. Forensics, interviews, backgrounds, patterns. But the emotional evidence? That's harder to trace. Because this wasn't just a murder scene. It was the final chapter of a long, slow breakdown that no one wanted to read until it was too late. One friend of the family, who asked not to be named, described a conversation with Michelle just days before the tragedy. She said, "I think he's struggling again, but I don't know how to help him anymore." Rob says we just need to love him through it. But I feel like we're drowning. Drowning. That word hits different now. Because now the world sees what the family may have known for years. That Nick Reiner, for all his privilege and promise, was a man teetering on the edge. And no one, not even his parents, knew how to pull him back. Or maybe they did know, and they were just too late. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the industry, not just because of who the Reiners were, but because of how it happened. It wasn't a car crash. It wasn't a drug overdose. It wasn't something the tabloids could blame on fame or excess. It was something personal, intimate, internal. A family turned in on itself. A story that doesn't fit Hollywood's usual narratives of redemption or downfall. And that's why it hit so hard. Because it wasn't about fame. It was about fear. And the night it all went down, that fear finally broke through the silence. A neighbor said they saw Rob earlier that week, walking alone at dusk. He looked haunted, like he was carrying something too heavy to put down. Did he know? Was there a final moment where Rob realized the truth about his son, the one he'd refused to admit for years? Or was it Michelle? Was she the one who saw the storm coming and tried to stop it? Or were they both just hoping for one more chance, one more good day, one more sign that everything would be okay? We'll never know. Because the truth is buried now. And the only person who may know exactly what happened in those final hours is the one person no one ever expected to become the villain of the story. Nick, the son, the secret everyone tiptoed around, the shadow behind the golden family portrait. And now he sits in a cell, waiting. And the industry? It's already moving on, already crafting its tributes, its in loving memory montages, its carefully worded statements that say nothing and mean less. But behind the scenes, people are asking each other in hushed voices, did you see this coming? Did you ever think? What could we have done? And always the same answer. I thought someone else would step in. But no one did. And what came next didn't just change the Reiner family. It changed how people looked at the people they once called untouchable. Because if they could fall, anyone could. But this wasn't just a family's fall. It was also a reckoning for everyone who knew them, especially those who knew just enough to be haunted by it now. And in the next chapter, we explore the aftermath, the media chaos, the conflicting reports, the way the story splintered into 1,000 versions, all with one horrifying thing in common. None of them bring Rob and Michelle back. What happens when a name makes a room go quiet? Not awkward quiet, not polite quiet, the kind of quiet that lands like a dropped glass, sharp, sudden, unmistakable. That was the effect Nick's name reportedly had in certain circles. You could feel it, people say, the shift, the way conversation would pivot just a few degrees off course, as if the air itself had decided, collectively, to look away. No accusations, no raised voices. Just a subtle agreement that some subjects were better left untouched. Why? Because in Hollywood, silence is often the loudest admission of all. Nick Reiner wasn't a mystery to the industry. Not exactly. People knew who he was. They knew where he came from. They knew the doors that opened automatically because of his last name, and the expectations that followed him through every single one of them. What they didn't know, or didn't want to know, was what happened when the doors closed. When the cameras shut off. When the dinners ended, when the smiles dropped. And that's where the discomfort began. From the outside, Nick's story was framed as a familiar Hollywood arc. A legacy kid navigating the pressures of fame. A creative finding his voice. A son collaborating with his father on a deeply personal project. That film, often described as raw and confessional, was praised for its honesty. But honesty on screen doesn't always translate to honesty in life. Behind that narrative, according to people who claimed proximity to the family, there were concerns. Not the kind that made headlines. The kind that never do. Mood swings. Isolation. Friction that didn't resolve itself neatly after a heartfelt conversation or a rehab stint or a promising new project. And here's the contradiction that haunted the family for years. Publicly, Nick was described as doing better. Privately, those close to the situation say the phrase was doing a lot of heavy lifting. Better compared to what? Better than last year? Better than the worst moments? Or just better at hiding it? Ask yourself this. How many times have you heard someone say, he's doing better, without ever asking what better actually means? That's how this story lived for so long. In vague reassurances. In half-truths. in careful phrasing that avoided specifics, because specifics invite scrutiny. And scrutiny is dangerous when your entire life has been built on a narrative of control. Nick's relationship with his father was, by most accounts, complicated. Loving, yes. Proud, certainly. But also heavy, weighted with expectation and disappointment in equal measure. Rob Reiner was a titan, a man whose work shaped cultural conversations, a director whose voice mattered, a figure who didn't just make movies, he made statements. Being his son meant living in a permanent comparison you never asked for. Every success felt borrowed. Every failure felt magnified. And people around Nick noticed the strain. The way he bristled at being introduced as Rob Reiner's son. The way he reportedly oscillated between wanting independence and needing approval. The way anger, when it surfaced, didn't always come with warning. Was it unusual? Maybe not. Was it concerning? Some thought so. But concern is easy to rationalize away when wrapped in privilege. He's just intense. He's passionate. He's misunderstood. Those are the words people use when they don't want to say the harder ones. And Michelle, by all accounts, played the role of mediator, the bridge, the one who smoothed edges and calmed tempers. Friends say she was deeply protective of Nick, perhaps more so than Rob, who struggled between being a father and being a public figure. But protection can become pressure. And pressure, when it builds, doesn't just disappear. It explodes. What makes this chapter of the story so uncomfortable is not what's known, but what isn't. The gaps, the missing pieces, the moments people now replay in their minds, asking themselves if they should have paid closer attention. There was the dinner Nick didn't attend.